It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals, like the egg in the Columbus story. They are both crushed, flat at the contact end. But their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I lived at the West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with the tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, and just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago.
I'm paralyzed with happiness.
A dozen people send their love to you from Chicago.
Do they miss me?
The whole town is desolate. All the cars have left rear wheel painted black as a morning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night long along the North Shore.
How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom. Tomorrow, you have to see the baby.
I'd like to.
She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her?
Never.
Well, you have to see her. She's...
What are you doing, Nick?
I'm a bond man.
Who with?
I told him.
Never heard of them.
This annoyed me. You will. You will if you stay in the East.
Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry. I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else.
At this point, Miss Baker said, "Absolutely," with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements, stood up into the room.
I'm stiff. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember.
Don't look at me. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon.
No thanks, I'm absolutely in training.
You are. How you ever get anything done is beyond me.
I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her, somewhere before.
You live in West Egg? I know somebody there.
I don't know a single...
You must know Gatsby.
Gatsby? What Gatsby?
Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the two young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch, open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind.
Why candles? In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day of the year. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day of the year and miss it.
We ought to plan something.
Alright, what do we plan? What do people plan?
Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger.
Go.
Look, I heard it.
We all looked. The knuckle was black and
You
blue.
did it, Tom. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great, big, hulking physical specimen of a...
I hate that word hulking, even in kidding.
hulking.
Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked all at once, unobtrusively and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening too would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase toward its close, in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself.
You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy. Can't you talk about crops or something?
Civilization's going to pieces. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard?
Why now?
Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. This idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved.
Tom's getting very profound. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was the word we...
Well, these books are all scientific. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things.
We've got to beat them down.
You ought to live in California.
This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and we produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that, do you see?
I'll tell you a family secret. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose?
That's why I came over tonight.
Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night until finally it began to affect his nose.
Things went from bad to worse.
Yes, things went from bad to worse until he finally had to give up his position.
The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing.
Go.
I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose. Doesn't he? An absolute rose?
Shh.
This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of, it's my neighbor.
Don't talk. I want to hear what happens.
Is something happening?
You mean to say you don't know? I thought everybody knew.
I don't.
Why, Tom's got some woman in New York.
Got some woman.
She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think?
It couldn't be helped. I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over on the Cunard or White Star Line. He's singing away. It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?
Very romantic. If it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables.
We don't know each other very well, Nick, even if we are cousins. You didn't come to my wedding.
I wasn't back from the war.
That's true. Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything.
Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment, I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter.
I suppose she talks and eats and everything.
Oh yes, listen, Nick. Let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?
Very much.
It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling, and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, so I turned my head away and wept. All right. I said, I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow. Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people. And I know. I've been everywhere and seen everything and done everything. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated.
Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post. The words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tune, the lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee, and she stood up.
10 o'clock. Time for this good girl to go to bed.
Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow over at Westchester.
Oh, you're Jordan Baker.
I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I had heard some story of her, too, a critical, unpleasant story, but what it was I had forgotten long ago.
Good night. Wake me at 8, won't you?
If you'll get up.
I will. Good night, Mr. Caraway. See you in noon.
Of course you will. In fact, I'll think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of, fling you together. You know, lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat, and all that sort of thing.
Good night. I haven't heard a word.
She's a nice girl. They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way.
Who oughtn't to?
Her family.
Her family is one aunt of 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her.
I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They came to the door with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, "Wait!"
I got to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west.
That's right. We heard that you were engaged.
It's libel. I'm too poor.
But we heard it. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true.
Dun, dun, dun.